when I found an envelope wedged into the gate of my farm. At first, I didn't think much of it. Another notice, perhaps just another flyer from the HOA. But as I pulled it out and saw the bold, familiar logo on the top of the letterhead, I felt a sense of dread settle in my chest. The HOA had been a constant presence in the background of my life, constantly issuing fines for this and that. But this letter was different. It wasn't just a reminder of some trivial code violation. No, this time they were making a claim that I couldn't ignore. I unfolded the letter and began to read. Dear Mr. Callahan, we regret to inform you that your property has violated several key community guidelines. Specifically, your barn, which you have recently expanded, is in direct violation of the Greater Simmons Valley HOA zoning standards. This includes unauthorized construction and a breach of aesthetic guidelines set forth by the community. You are hereby given 14 days to remove the structure and comply with HOA standards or face legal action. The words were a slap in the face. My barn had been standing for over a decade, and the only expansion I had made was a simple repair to the roof. There was no mention of how this was a violation or what exactly the aesthetic standards were, just a vague threat of legal action. This was a direct attack. The HOA had no right to tell me what to do with my land. My property was mine, and I had no intention of bowing to their demands. But this wasn't just about a barn or some petty fine. It was about something bigger. The HOA had become more than just a set of rules. It had become a tool for control, a way for a few people, led by Karen Whitaker, to dominate the community. I knew immediately that this wasn't a fight I could let go. I had to do something, not just to protect my farm, but to stand up for my right to live freely. I couldn't let them take my property under false pretenses. I picked up my phone and called a few neighbors I knew had also been harassed by the HOA. It was time to find out if anyone else was ready to take a stand. The next day, just as I was finishing up some work in the barn, I saw a black SUV pull up the driveway. It was a large, unmarked vehicle, and two men stepped out. They were wearing vests that said HOA compliance on them, but something about their demeanor was off. The vests looked too official, almost like something you'd see in a police department, but there were no badges or other official markings. These men weren't law enforcement. They were self-appointed enforcers, and I could tell they weren't here to just ask a few questions. One of them, taller and more muscular than the other, approached me. Mr. Callahan, we've been sent by the Greater Simmons Valley HOA to inspect your barn for violations, he said, holding out a clipboard with what appeared to be an inspection form. Inspect my barn? I repeated, crossing my arms. You've got no right to come on my property without a warrant. And what exactly gives you the authority to inspect my barn anyway? The man didn't flinch. We're acting on behalf of the HOA, and we have full authority to inspect properties for compliance with community rules, he said, his voice stern. I knew immediately that something was off. The HOA didn't have the legal power to conduct inspections like the police or building inspectors could. This wasn't an official inspection. It was a show of force. And these men weren't legitimate officers. They were acting as though they had the law behind them, but they didn't. They were just thugs in tactical vests, trying to intimidate me into submission. I won't have to ask you to leave, I said firmly. You're trespassing on private property without any legal justification. If you wanted to talk about this, you can go through the proper legal channels like everyone else. The second man, who had been silent until now, stepped forward slightly, his hand resting near his holster. It was a subtle but threatening move. You really want to make this difficult? He asked, his tone dripping with intimidation. I didn't flinch. I knew how to handle situations like this. I had dealt with more dangerous people in my past than a couple of fake HOA cops. You're not law enforcement, I said calmly, and you don't have a warrant. So you're trespassing, and I suggest you leave before I call the authorities. They exchanged a glance, clearly frustrated that their intimidation tactics weren't working. After a long pause, the first man spoke again, his voice now edged with annoyance. We'll be reporting this, he said, as if threatening me. You'll regret not cooperating. I've dealt with people like you before, I said, my voice low. You can report whatever you want. But if you're not going to leave, I'll call the sheriff's department and let them know 2 fake HOA cops are trespassing on my land. After a tense moment, they turned and walked back to their SUV. I stood at the gate, watching them drive off, a sense of satisfaction running through me. They had underestimated me, thinking I'd cave under pressure. They didn't know who they were dealing with. But I knew this wasn't over. If the HOA thought they could push me around, they were mistaken. I had the land, and I was ready to fight for it. I just needed to figure out what my next move would be. After the encounter with the fake HOA cops, I knew this was just the beginning. I needed to get ahead of the situation and understand exactly what I was dealing with. The HOA had always been a thorn in the side of the community, but this felt different. Karen Whitaker, the HOA president, had made it clear that she was willing to do anything to assert control. I wasn't going to let her run my life, and I was certain she was doing this to others in the neighborhood as well. I began to dig deeper into the HOA's structure, its finances, and any shady dealings I could uncover. I spent the next few days researching public records, zoning laws, and HOA regulations. It wasn't long before I realized the extent of Karen's power. She wasn't just the president of a small homeowners association. She had been using her position to make money through backdoor deals with developers, manipulating zoning rules, and pushing through projects that only benefited herself and a select few. I spoke to a few neighbors who had been dealing with the HOA's tactics for years. They shared stories of unfair fines, unreasonable demands, and how Karen used the HOA as her personal tool to control people's properties. One neighbor, Tom, who had lived in the area for over 20 years, told me how Karen had tried to seize his land by threatening him with endless fines and harassment over trivial issues. He finally given in, but many others had either left or paid fines they couldn't afford just to keep the peace. But what really got my attention was when I found out that Karen had been pushing for a massive development project right next to my property. It seemed like every time she made a new rule or guideline, it was somehow tied to her own personal interests. The project she was pushing would have meant a major land grab, and my farm was directly in the way of the planned expansion. It was becoming clear Karen wasn't just trying to enforce rules. She was using the HOA to gain control of land for personal profit. I knew that if I didn't act quickly, my property, and many others in the neighborhood would be swallowed up in her development scheme. It wasn't just about the barn anymore. This was about protecting my land from being taken under false pretenses, and it was about standing up against the corrupt system that had been controlling the neighborhood for years. That night, I called my lawyer and told him everything I had uncovered. This is more than just a zoning issue or a property dispute, I said. I think we're dealing with a case of fraud and coercion. We need to put a stop to this before it goes any further. The next step was clear. I had to expose Karen and the HOA's illegal dealings, but I needed more evidence. I wasn't about to let them take my land without a fight. After digging into the HOA's shady activities and uncovering Karen's personal interests in manipulating the system, I realized I couldn't just sit back and wait for the situation to blow over. I had to act, and I had to act fast. I wasn't just going to fight for my barn or my land anymore. This was bigger than that. It was about ensuring that no one else in the neighborhood would have to deal with the same corruption and manipulation that I had experienced. I could see it now. Karen wasn't just trying to push people around for trivial violations. She was after something much bigger. She had been using her position to make deals with developers and get kickbacks, all while the community suffered. If I was going to stop her, I had to take away her power. And to do that, I had to strike at the very core of her operation. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I wasn't just fighting Karen. I was fighting a system that could keep destroying people's lives unless someone stepped up to stop it. The only way to do that was to hit the HOA where it would hurt the most, by taking control of the land they used to assert power over the community. I began looking into the land surrounding my farm. The HOA owned several parcels that bordered my property, and many of them were key to their plans for expansion. If I could acquire that land, I'd take away their ability to control me and the rest of the neighborhood. I wasn't going to let them push me around anymore. It was time to fight back with the one thing they couldn't control: money. I reached out to a real estate agent to see if any of the HOA-owned properties were up for sale. To my surprise, they were. Apparently, the HOA had been struggling financially for years, and they were eager to sell off parcels of land to developers to make up for their losses. I put in an offer for the land adjacent to mine, and after some negotiation, I was able to purchase it at a reasonable price. With the land now in my hands, I realized I had the power to control the area around my farm and to build a wall of protection against the HOA. I knew I needed to act quickly before Karen or anyone else from the HOA could interfere. It was time to take the next step in my plan to protect my land and expose the corruption within the HOA. Now that I had secured the land surrounding my property, I knew I had to act swiftly to ensure that Karen and the HOA could no longer intimidate me or my neighbors. The first thing I did was visit the parcels I had just acquired. As I stood on the land, it struck me just how much power I had taken back. The HOA had once tried to use the land to trap me, but now it was mine, and I was going to make sure it stayed that way. The next logical step was clear. I had to physically assert my control over the land in a way that would be impossible for the HOA to ignore. If they thought they could push me around, I was going to show them just how wrong they were. I began drawing up plans to build a wall, a symbolic and physical barrier around the land I had just purchased. The idea was simple: make a statement, make it clear that I was done being controlled, and set a boundary that no one could cross. I hired a team of workers to get started on the wall. This wasn't just about protection, it was about taking back the narrative. Every stone, every brick laid in place was a message to Karen and her board members. They no longer had the power to dictate what happened on my property. The wall would be a physical reminder of my resolve, something that would send a clear message to the HOA and anyone else who thought they could challenge me. While the construction was underway, I made sure to reach out to my neighbors. I wanted them to know that I wasn't just fighting for my own rights. I was fighting for everyone in the neighborhood who had been intimidated or bullied by Karen and her HOA. I began to explain my plan to my neighbors, many of whom had been too afraid to stand up to the HOA on their own. The more I talked to them, the more I realized they were ready to fight back too. Karen had forced them into silence, but now seeing someone take action, they were starting to find their voice again. I started gathering signatures for a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely. It wasn't just about the barn or the fines anymore. The HOA had been a tool for control, and now that I had control over the land, it was time to take the next step: take down the corrupt system entirely. When the wall was finally finished, I stood at the top of the property and looked out across the land. The HOA no longer had any claim over it, and with the wall in place, they wouldn't be able to intimidate anyone again. It was a victory, but the fight wasn't over. The HOA was still operational, and as long as Karen remained in power, she would continue to scheme and manipulate. The real work was ahead of me, bringing down the rest of the corrupt system and ensuring that no one else had to endure what we had been through. With the wall built and my property secured, it was time to turn my attention to the next step: exposing the corruption within the HOA. I had already begun gathering evidence of Karen's underhanded dealings, and now I needed to take it to the authorities. It wasn't just about getting revenge on her. It was about making sure she and anyone else involved in the HOA's corrupt activities faced the consequences of their actions. I reached out to a few of the residents who had been quietly documenting their own experiences with the HOA over the years. They had collected evidence of Karen's bullying tactics, fake violations, and the money she had taken from the neighborhood through unjust fines and fees. Together, we had enough to take down the entire corrupt system. We contacted a local investigative reporter who had covered stories about corrupt HOAs in the past. She was intrigued by what we had uncovered and agreed to help expose Karen's illegal activities. We worked together to piece everything together: the fraudulent fines, the backdoor deals with developers, and the financial mismanagement that had been going on for years. It was time to make sure Karen's reign of terror was finally brought to an end. With the evidence ready, we contacted the local authorities. I made sure the story was airtight, with financial documents, emails, and records of the HOA's mismanagement all included. We didn't just want to get Karen arrested, we wanted the whole HOA system to be dismantled. It was about restoring justice to the community, making sure no one else had to endure what we had gone through. The local authorities took our case seriously. They launched an investigation into Karen and the HOA's financial dealings. Meanwhile, the media picked up the story, and soon, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with excitement. People were starting to realize the extent of the corruption and the abuse of power that had been happening right under their noses for years. Karen tried to fight back, of course. She denied everything and accused me of making false claims. She even tried to rally some of the board members who were still loyal to her, but it was too late. The truth was out, and the momentum was on our side. Within a few weeks, the authorities had raided the HOA office and found a trove of illegal documents. Karen was arrested for embezzling funds, misappropriating HOA fees, and fraudulently misrepresenting her dealings with developers. The board members who had backed her were also brought in for questioning, and several of them resigned or were forced to step down as the investigation continued. It was a moment of sweet victory, not just for me, but for every resident who had been bullied by the HOA over the years. The once feared HOA system had been dismantled, and now the neighborhood was free to rebuild without the looming threat of manipulation hanging over us. But even as Karen's empire crumbled, I knew this wasn't the end. The fight for justice had taken a significant step forward, but we still needed to make sure no one else could ever use the HOA to manipulate and control people again. With Karen and the corrupt HOA board out of the picture, the next challenge was to rebuild the neighborhood and ensure that the mistakes of past wouldn't be repeated. The damage caused by the HOA's control and Karen's exploitation had left many residents distrustful and hesitant to participate in community affairs. But I knew that the only way to move forward was to create an inclusive and transparent system that worked for everyone. I called for a community meeting, inviting all the residents to come and discuss how we could rebuild together. The room was packed with familiar faces, some of whom I hadn't seen in years, as they had kept their heads down out of fear of the HOA. It was inspiring to see the room filled with so much energy. There was a sense of hope in the air, something that had been missing for a long time. The first thing we did was talk about what we wanted from our new system. We agreed that the HOA, as it had been, was done. It would no longer be a group of unelected individuals telling us what to do behind closed doors. Instead, we would form a community board that was fully transparent and accountable to everyone. Decisions would be made through open voting, with every resident having a voice in the process. We also decided to get rid of the old rules that had been used to control us, such as the restrictions on personal property and the unfair fines. The new rules were simple: keep your property maintained, respect your neighbors, and make sure we all contribute to the well-being of the community. It wasn't about micromanaging people's lives. It was about creating a place where everyone could live comfortably without feeling persecuted for minor infractions. I also made sure to push for one key principle: no one would ever be silenced again. The new board would be open to suggestions and concerns, and there would be regular town hall meetings where residents could raise issues and have them addressed immediately. We built a clear communication channel so that everyone had access to the same information and could hold the board accountable. Once the new framework was in place, we started organizing social events to foster a sense of community. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now came together for potlucks, weekend cleanups, and charity events. We worked side by side to improve the common areas, plant new trees, and make the neighborhood look like the place it should have been all along. As time passed, the transformation was undeniable. The neighborhood felt different, alive, vibrant, and full of hope. People weren't afraid to speak up anymore, and there was a sense of camaraderie that had been sorely lacking in the past. We were more than just neighbors. We were a community that had fought back and won. But I knew there was still work to be done. The corrupt systems that had nearly destroyed us weren't gone forever. There would always be people like Karen, looking to seize control and take advantage of others. But now we were prepared. We had built a foundation that could stand strong against any future threats. Just as things were beginning to settle, a new threat emerged, this time from an unexpected direction. Though Karen and the old HOA board were gone, I started receiving anonymous messages warning me that the issues with the neighborhood were far from over. At first, I dismissed them as nothing more than remnants of the old HOA trying to stir trouble from the shadows. But the more I investigated, the more I realized something was brewing. I was contacted by a few residents who had noticed odd behavior in the weeks following Karen's departure. There were people who had been quietly watching the community, particularly around the areas I had purchased land from the HOA. It seemed like the land I had bought wasn't the only parcel of interest. There were rumors of new buyers in the neighborhood, buyers who weren't local, weren't interested in community living, and whose intentions didn't seem to align with our values. I decided to dig deeper into these new individuals. A local informant told me that a powerful real estate conglomerate was looking to invest in properties around our area, specifically the land that the HOA had owned before I purchased it. The buyers had been quietly acquiring other parcels in the area, and their interest wasn't just in making a profit. They had a much bigger plan. They wanted to buy up as much land as possible, bulldoze old homes, and replace them with high-end condos and commercial complexes. It wasn't hard to connect the dots. The same players who had been involved with the HOA's shady dealings were now trying to take control of the entire neighborhood. They had realized the value of the land and the opportunities it presented for development. What had started as a personal vendetta with Karen had now turned into a larger battle to protect the future of our entire community. I couldn't let this happen. I'd already fought once to take control of my land and preserve my way of life, and now I had to do it again for the entire neighborhood. The fight wasn't just about me anymore. It was about preserving the integrity of our community and making sure that our land stayed in the hands of the people who lived here, not corporate developers who only cared about turning a profit. I called an emergency meeting with a new neighborhood board, and we began planning our next steps. We couldn't let this outside force swoop in and take over. We needed to band together once again to protect our homes and our way of life. I knew this wasn't going to be easy. The stakes were higher than ever, but this time, we were ready. The community we had fought so hard to rebuild was now in danger, and we were prepared to do whatever it took to save it. After uncovering the real estate conglomerate's plan, it became clear that the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about a few people trying to take advantage of the HOA's corrupt system. This was about an outside force trying to reshape the entire neighborhood for their own profit, with no regard for the community or its residents. We knew we had to act fast. The first thing we did was band together and start researching the new developers. We combed through local government records, zoning laws, and land acquisition reports. What we found was shocking. This conglomerate had already made significant strides in acquiring neighboring properties, including some of the key parcels I had previously bought from the HOA. They were moving fast, and they had deep pockets. But they underestimated one thing. The residents who had fought Karen and the HOA had proven we were capable of standing our ground. We had already taken down one corrupt system, and we weren't about to let another take its place. I called a meeting with the neighborhood board and the most active residents. We needed a strategy to protect the remaining land in the area. Our options were clear. We could either fight to block the development and keep our homes intact, or we could allow the conglomerate to buy up more land and bulldoze our neighborhood, turning it into a high-end development that only catered to the wealthy. We decided that we weren't going to let that happen. The first part of our plan was to reach out to local officials and city planners to make sure the conglomerate's plans would be met with resistance. We needed to ensure that their plans for development didn't slip through the cracks of local government, and we began rallying support from other neighborhoods who were also affected by the development. But we also needed to take action in our own neighborhood. We couldn't rely solely on city officials to block the deal. I took it upon myself to speak to the media, to raise awareness about what was happening in our community. With the press on our side, we began to expose the developers' plans to gentrify our neighborhood and force out longtime residents. We collected signatures for petitions and started a social media campaign to make sure the world knew what was happening. It wasn't long before the developers realized they were up against a united front. They tried to downplay the situation, insisting that their development plans would bring jobs and growth to the area. But we weren't fooled. We knew that what they were really after was control over the land, the power to tear down our homes, and the chance to profit off our community's struggles. We kept the pressure on, attending public hearings, organizing protests, and making sure that our voices were heard. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of moments when I wondered if we could actually pull it off. But each time I looked at the faces of my neighbors, determined and ready to fight for their homes, I knew we couldn't give up. The fight for our neighborhood was just beginning, but we were more united than ever. We had fought to protect our homes once, and now we were going to fight to ensure our future. Together, we would prove that no matter how big or powerful the enemy was, we were stronger as a community. As the fight to stop the developers from taking over our neighborhood escalated, we knew we needed to fortify our position with legal action. With the help of a few residents who had connections to local attorneys, we were able to assemble a legal team that could challenge the developers' zoning permits. We needed to prove that the development plan was not only harmful to our neighborhood, but also violated several local environmental and zoning laws. I had never been one to back down from a fight, but I knew we couldn't win this on sheer willpower alone. The legal system was going to be our most powerful weapon in this battle. The attorneys we hired helped us file a series of lawsuits to prevent the developers from moving forward. We argued that the rezoning of the land, which would allow for large-scale commercial and luxury residential development, would displace longtime residents and destroy the local ecosystem that made our area so unique. But we couldn't do this alone. As the legal action moved forward, we saw a wave of support from unexpected places. Some of the smaller businesses that had been thriving in the neighborhood began to rally behind us. They were worried that if the developers moved in, they would be pushed out by higher rent and the gentrification that followed. Even a few local environmental groups reached out to offer their support, recognizing that the development would have a significant negative impact on the local wildlife and the land's natural resources. It was clear that the developers were starting to feel the pressure. They had been confident that they could simply buy the land and bulldoze it, But now they were faced with a united front that included not only the residents but also the legal system, local businesses, and even environmental advocates. It was the kind of resistance they hadn't prepared for. During one of the key hearings, the developers tried to argue that their project was for the greater good and that it would provide much-needed housing and jobs. But I wasn't buying it. I stood up in front of the city council, my voice firm and unshaken, and made my case. This is about control. This is about people who don't care about this neighborhood or its residents. It's about people who are only interested in profits. This neighborhood has been home to many families for generations, and we won't let you come in and tear it down. The pressure was mounting. The developers, who had once been so confident, began to falter. The council members seemed to be taking our concerns seriously, and in the following weeks, I received word that the developers had agreed to delay their project pending further review. It wasn't a win yet, but it was a huge step in the right direction. The delay was just the beginning of our victory, but it wasn't over. As the hearings continued, the developers' plans started to unravel. They had expected the local authorities to simply rubber stamp their proposals, but the resistance we had mounted, combined with the legal challenges, public outcry, and media attention, forced them to reconsider their approach. The developers began to panic. They realized that the legal battles, the public opposition, and the pressure from the environmental groups were making it increasingly difficult to push their plans forward. They had underestimated the strength of our community and the resolve of the residents who were ready to fight for their homes. One afternoon, I received a call from my lawyer. "You won," he said. "The developers have officially pulled out. They're not going to pursue the project anymore." I couldn't believe it at first. After all the long nights, the meetings, the legal battles, and the protests, it was finally over. The developers had backed down, and our neighborhood was safe from their plans to gentrify and destroy it. The sense of relief was overwhelming, but so was the pride in knowing that we had stood up for what was right. The developers released a statement saying they had reevaluated their plans and decided to seek other opportunities. The truth was, they realized they couldn't win this battle, and they knew they would face years of legal headaches and public backlash if they pressed on. They cut their losses and walked away. But while we celebrated the victory, I knew this wasn't just about one project being stopped. It was about the message we had sent. We had shown that the residents of this community were no longer going to sit back and let outsiders walk all over us. We had the power to protect our homes, our families, and our way of life. With the developers backing down and the immediate threat to our neighborhood finally eliminated, the next challenge was to rebuild the trust that had been shattered by the HOA and the looming corporate takeover. The neighborhood had come together in the face of adversity, but we needed to make sure that the victory didn't lead to complacency. We had won this battle, but there were always going to be new challenges ahead. The real work, as I saw it, was to restore the spirit of the community. We began by holding a neighborhood celebration. It was a simple event, just a barbecue and a few games, but it was an important step in bringing people together again. The sense of unity that had been forged in the heat of battle needed to be carried forward, and I wanted to remind everyone of why we fought in the first place, to protect our homes and our way of life. It wasn't just about stopping developers. It was about ensuring that the people of this neighborhood had a voice in how it was shaped. As we gathered around the picnic tables, sharing stories and laughing, I could see the change in the residents. They were more connected than ever before. Neighbors who had once been isolated, afraid to speak out or even interact, were now chatting openly. It was clear that the HOA's control had bred fear and division, but now the air was lighter and the future looked bright. We also worked on building stronger community connections, so that if something like this ever happened again, we would be ready. We formed new neighborhood groups that focused on everything from safety and public services to organizing community events. We made sure that everyone knew they had a say in what happened in our neighborhood and that they could make a real difference. As the weeks went by, the changes were unmistakable. People began fixing up their homes, organizing block parties, and helping each other out in ways they hadn't before. It was like a fresh start, and I could see the neighborhood becoming a place where people genuinely cared about each other. But more than that, we had proven something to ourselves. When we stand together, we can protect what we hold dear. We had fought for our homes, and we had won. But it wasn't just about defeating the developers. It was about reclaiming our sense of community and our shared responsibility to keep it safe, healthy, and vibrant. I knew the HOA was gone, but it had left us with something valuable, the realization that we didn't need to rely on anyone else to protect our neighborhood. We were the ones in control now, and the fight had made us stronger.